British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing a major backlash from his own MPs over new coronavirus restrictions. Dozens of Conservative Party lawmakers have slammed new rules, including face mask wearing, testing, self-isolation and vaccine passes. Conservative MP Steve Baker, for example, has accused Boris Johnson of creating a miserable dystopia with disproportionate curbs. Boris Johnson, however, maintains tougher measures are needed urgently to avoid hospitals from becoming overwhelmed. At least 60 Tory MPs, possibly more, are reported to be set to rebel in votes later, particularly over so-called COVID passes. The measures are expected to pass, though, with opposition support. Over the last week, opinion polls have shown support for Boris Johnson falling. A sleaze scandal, the refurbishment of the Downing Street flat, alleged 2020 Christmas lockdown parties, all appearing to cut through to voters. On Monday, the UK became the first government to officially announce a death in someone who had tested positive for the new Omicron COVID variant. Omicron accounts for around 40% of cases in London, and the UK is speeding up an ambitious COVID booster programme aiming to hit 1 million booster doses a day. Well, for the latest, we can cross to our London correspondent, Benji Hire. Benji, explain why, if Boris Johnson's so-called Plan B measures are going to be passed by MPs later, why is that expected rebellion from some of his Conservative colleagues so significant?
That's a good question, Ollie, because as you say, this is due to pass. Boris Johnson has a big enough majority that he won in the 2019 election to see off any rebellion, and these policies will likely be supported by the opposition Labour Party too. But here's the crucial point. If enough MPs, dozens perhaps, you mentioned 60, possibly 70 or 80, decide that they're not going to put their name to these new pieces of legislation, that could be a major dent to Boris Johnson's reputation after what has been a very difficult couple of weeks for him. What it comes down to is these new mandatory COVID passes and other separate pieces of legislation mandating masks inside many indoor settings, and also setting out how people should take daily tests if they're in contact with someone who has contracted coronavirus. And this is proving to be quite controversial. You gave a quote from backbencher Steve Baker before. Another Tory MP, Andrea Leadsom, said one of her constituents was now less afraid of COVID than she is of intrusive government policies. This is in spite of spiralling COVID-19 cases in the UK. Sajid Javid mentioning that there could possibly be 200,000 cases a day across the country. That's not total, that is per day. And the government, despite this, not imminently deciding to bring in any fresh lockdown prospects, any further restrictions, but pinning their hopes on that booster programme that you mentioned as well. And there's been quite a considerable uptake so far. Just on the first day that those bookings were made available to all adults over the age of 18, 500,000 people decided to get themselves registered. And queues along some major hotspots in London, or vaccine centres in London, queuing round the block across major bridges in order to try to get that third COVID boost and give as much immunity as possible against the disease.
And those COVID passes that you mentioned, which for some of the Conservative MPs who appear set to rebel, is really the key issue here that they are opposed to. How are those proposed COVID passes going to work?
That's right. I mean, practically speaking, the way it would work is that if you wanted to get into a venue where there were going to be several thousand people, it depends whether it's indoor or outdoor, whether it's seated or unseated, but if there's going to be some sort of large gathering, then you would have to show your COVID pass. The reason that many backbenchers feel that this is sort of an infringement of civil liberties is that there's a suggestion that people are being forced into taking vaccines to get this pass. That's not quite the case, though. Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is insisting that this does not mean the government is introducing so-called vaccine passports. The reason being is that to get this pass to enter a venue, to go to a nightclub or a concert or a football match, for example, you don't only have to rely on getting that vaccine status. You could, for example, show a negative test result, and that is reassuring to some backbenchers. And another point that might get a few Conservative MPs over the line is that at this current point, at least, people who want to use that COVID pass to go to those different events won't need to have had a third booster jab. Only those 2 vaccinations to make someone fully vaccinated under the current rules would be required to get that COVID pass. But that doesn't mean that that's going to go seamlessly through the House of Commons. We are, as you mentioned before, expecting quite a huge rebellion, one potentially that would be a record for this government since Boris Johnson won that election in 2019.